What do you feel that the stakes are in the outcome of political events in the US in this calendar year? Climate itself at a global level will be implicated by what happens as a result. How scared should I be?
I think fairly scared. And one reason is that the US Constitution, quite frankly, it's not fit for purpose. It is set up for potential political, well, disaster, really.
This is Wicked Problems. I'm Richard Delavan.
The biggest threats by far are not foreign enemies, but internal disintegration driven by, above all, the threat of climate change. But if you are to persuade the mass of the population to make real sacrifices in the struggle against climate change, you've got to convince them that the burdens, the sacrifices, will be as far as possible shared throughout society.
So it's election year, seemingly everywhere. But one election trumps them all for the potential impact on climate and climate tech. And this week we learned that America's answer to Lord Voldemort has told the oil industry that if they get him $1 billion in campaign money, they can basically do what they want. I'll let the League of Conservation Voters tell you in brief about it.
$1 billion. That is the price tag Donald Trump put on our planet. The Washington Post just revealed that Trump promised oil executives that he will roll back all of President Biden's climate progress if they raise him $1 billion. And that isn't the end of it. The oil industry has already written executive orders for Trump to sign on day one.
Despite everything, Trump's odds of winning the election are probably about 50-50. And the consequences would be, well, in a nice little piece of analysis in March, Carbon Brief actually put a number on it. 4 billion. 4 billion tons of CO2 extra into the atmosphere by 2030. About a year's worth of emissions from the EU, and causing nearly $1 trillion in global climate damages. It was great to hear Rupert Reed and Liam Kavanagh in a previous episode talk about their plan to activate the climate majority, a majority that former UK Energy Minister Chris Skidmore pointed to when speaking at the Climate Impact Summit in London this week, before going on to say this about his former party.
The party, that its current state, the Conservative Party, is endangering people's lives, people's jobs, the opportunities for communities to grow further by taking a negative approach and rowing back on the energy transition. And we can see that coming.
Maybe it's time to think about whether politics, as practiced in the nation-state system we've had for about 400 years, is really up to dealing with climate. So I reached out to one of the smartest guys I know, Anatol Lieven, now at the Quincy Institute in Washington. Before we get into it, just a quick note to say that if you're a paying subscriber to Wicked Problems, thanks. And if you're not, come on board. Your generosity can help us bring you more conversations like this one. And if you could, do us one other favor. On whatever device you're listening to this on, you can leave us a rating and review in Apple Podcasts or Spotify, which really will help other people find the show. Now, here's the conversation. Dr. Anatol Lieven has had a stellar journalistic career reporting from the former Soviet Union and Pakistan before pivoting to academia at places like King's College London and Georgetown University in Qatar, which is where I happened to get to know him when he published Climate Change and the Nation State. My favorite review of that book was by Aris Rousinos in Unheard. I'm just going to quote it here. In a troubling book aimed at political conservatives and the security establishment, the eminent international relations scholar Anatol Lieven addresses these dark realities head-on. Lieven observes that despite the UK's 2008 national security strategy declaring climate change potentially the greatest challenge to global stability and security, and therefore to national security, almost nothing has been done to prepare for the seemingly now inevitable storm heading our way. Now, this is my favorite bit. Aiming not to just shift the Overton window of green politics, Lieven smashes it, then demolishes the wall containing it, kicking the rubble and broken glass in all directions with wild abandon. Greens, Liberals, and Conservatives all become targets of his ire in succession, as he argues that all must be forced to abandon their most cherished political beliefs in the face of the coming catastrophe. These days, Dr. Lieven is back in the US with a ringside seat for all the things that 2024 may yet bring, as the director of the Eurasia program at the Quincy Institute for Responsible Statecraft. Dr. Lieven, welcome to the program.
Hi, Richard. Nice to be back.
So good to talk to you again. And so it's been, it's been 4 years, right, since Climate Change in the Nation State came out in its first edition. So I guess broad question, first of all, just to summarize for the audience, I could give a recap, but you'd probably do a better job, given it's your book, of the main kind of thrust of the argument. And then I'll come back to maybe asking you how you feel that's fared in the 4 years of data we've had to accumulate since then.
Well, as the review you cited said, I had quite a lot of targets in the book, sort of serial murderer. So I began by arguing that our security establishments, in particular, for very understandable inherited reasons and institutional reasons, but have got the real threats to our societies quite wrong, and that the biggest threats by far are not foreign enemies, or at least not great power enemies, but internal disintegration driven by, above all, the threat of climate change, but climate change feeding into other huge problems, notably migration and the socioeconomic inequality, unemployment, underemployment. And in other parts of the world, also driving migration, the problem of weak and failing states. This came very much out of my long experience of Afghanistan and Pakistan and some other places in the Middle East. So that was the first argument. The second argument was that because there is so much resistance, less now to, accepting climate change as a reality, because frankly, given the evidence from the last 4 years, you cannot deny that. But when it comes to action, that's, as we've seen, a very different matter. So I was saying that the security establishments can play a vital role in really alerting people and stirring them up to the extent of the danger, because people do tend, maybe unfortunately, but still, to react, more to arguments about their security than, about threats coming down the line. I went on from there, and this is what makes me... so, having infuriated much of the right and the establishment, I then go on to infuriate the left by suggesting, also, in an appeal to the security establishments, but that patriotism or nationalism are, or should be, key to trying to mobilize real political support and mass support for action against climate change. Because, as we all know, one of the key problems is that you are asking people to make, real sacrifices today to ward off dangers which, although, they're very apparent now, will only kick in a really catastrophic way in the lives of our children and grandchildren. But of course, when it comes to patriotism, that's precisely what patriotism is about. The idea of being, loyal to your country as it exists this week or this generation is nonsense. You are, loyal to your country as it has existed in history in the past, and as you hope it will continue to exist in the future. And I refer to the Great Seal of the United States, Novus Ordo Seclorum, a new order for the ages. And I say, it doesn't say, oh, the US Constitution is so like last week, it says this is, this is something that we hope to carry forward for humanity into the future.
Right.
That didn't go down at all well with the left. But then I make a very strong argument for the idea of a Green New Deal, and that if you are to persuade the mass of the population to make real sacrifices in the struggle against climate change, you've got to convince them, that there will be compensation for the population in general, and especially, of course, for those most immediately affected by action against climate change. And secondly, that the burdens, the sacrifices will be as far as possible shared throughout society by the rich as well. And I say that, for example, President Macron's diesel tax was in itself entirely justified as part of the fight against climate change. But it was absolutely catastrophic, politically speaking, to combine this with tax cuts for the rich and cuts in corporation tax and free market economics. So I really concentrate on that. And then in a final cut at the contemporary left and the Greens, I say that, look, if this is going to work politically, it's got to be directed at society as a whole. And trying to make this something just for, or mainly for, racial minorities or sexual minorities and associated with sort of wider cultural agendas is going to be absolutely disastrous, because it as good as tells the white working classes, who, as we've seen, are in a pretty nervous and irritable mood already, that they're not going to get anything out of this, that this isn't for them, they'll lose their jobs and be kicked to the side. Well, that's not an election winner.
Right.
So anyway, that's the argument of the book.
And so, and over the last 4 years, we've had a number of events that have suggested that, a lot of the grounding that, and events that then took a lot of other people by surprise. It seems like, your kind of worldview did anticipate some of these responses perhaps a little bit better than others. And I don't want this just to be a complete, kind of conversation about how great your ideas are and how great I am.
Well, not
about that. But like, unfortunately for the audience, I do agree with you on most of these things. So I'll have to step outside myself to try to interrogate a little bit differently. But in the last 4 years, we've had, right, with the installation of Joe Biden as president of the United States, and framing first the CHIPS Act and the Bipartisan Infrastructure Act, and then the Inflation Reduction Act in 2022, and in parallel the EU in its rhetoric around the Green Deal and the Net Zero Infrastructure Act, framing both of those as responses of industrial policy to a rising China about industries of the future, and not just centered on climate policy per se, as being, something that I would have imagined would be something that you would have said, oh, that seems smart based on, the pre-existing worldview. But tell me, how things have played out, versus how you thought they might, in that worldview that you articulated.
Well, I was very encouraged, of course, by the Inflation Reduction Act. I also pointed out that, as COVID demonstrated, the argument that the money is not there is in fact nonsense. If we see something as a real emergency, we can generate huge amounts of money. I mean, quantitative easing, the money, essentially thrown at the banks over that, could have been used for green infrastructure development. But that was encouraging, and some of the moves in Europe were encouraging. But two things were not so encouraging. The first, something which so often happens in the world, comes out of left field, was the Russian invasion of Ukraine, which really, tipped everyone back to military spending, great power competition, and of course energy security. And in the long run, as to some extent we're doing, that has to be about alternative energy. But in the short term, it's largely about coal and fracking, which of course has set things back a very long way, both in Europe and in America. The other thing is, of course, that although, as I say, actually the money is available, in practice, budgets everywhere are being squeezed. In the end, 5 billion spent by the British, for example, on aid to Ukraine is 5 billion less for other things. And if it goes to anything else, it'll be to the National Health Service. And as a result of these, these budgetary constraints, you have seen across Europe, including Britain, people, in fact, in Britain, both the Conservative and the Labour opposition backing away from their their plans and their promises about climate change and alternative energy. And in the US, of course, you now have surges in the military budget, huge amounts of aid to Ukraine. In Europe, you have tremendous increases, at least planned, in military spending. And everywhere you see the energy leaching away from action on climate change. The other thing is that it's not perhaps as extreme as it was a few years ago, but if you take the Greens in Europe, they have been absolutely disastrous in terms of, the last people of whom one would have expected this, but eclipsing real action against climate change for the sake of a highly militarized approach to Russia. Still, these imported cultural agendas from the United States. Much of the time it seems they're talking as much about transgender rights as they are about climate change, and the continued obsession, especially in Germany, with abolishing nuclear energy, which, as I say in the book, may be necessary and desirable in the long term, but in the short term, when you don't have enough alternative energy to replace it with, it is, of course, ludicrous.
Well, I did have the Irish MEP Kieran Cuff from the Green Party on the program not too long ago, and to give him his due, I do think that there are people like him in the European Parliament anyway, who certainly have, with his role in helping to broker what seems like a landmark agreement in terms of decarbonizing building infrastructure over the next 20 years in Europe. I take your point. I guess my question is, in terms of how we have the two schools of thought, at least two, there's probably more, in terms of how do we see this evolving international situation when it comes to the ability to cooperate about climate action. And we have, on the one hand, people will say this is absolutely terrible if the US and China are going to compete on industrial policy, or if the EU is going to be a third competitor, then that's going to be terrible in terms of competing over supply chains for battery minerals, or for, kind of putting tariffs on very cheap BYD electric vehicles that might be imported into the US or Europe. And, that's going to stymie action that could otherwise, be driven by the market in exchange for kind of getting some jobs into Marjorie Taylor Greene's district in Georgia that she doesn't want, that she won't be happy about anyway, because there's something to do with green stuff. But on the other hand, there are people who say that the rivalry with China, as long as it's managed and maintained, actually is useful in kind of building up industrial capacity in different parts of the world, diversifying supply chain, and being able to basically also make it so that those jobs in districts like Marjorie Taylor Greene's are in fact helping to embed and to kind of decenter it as a partisan debate stuff about, this is about jobs, this is about the economy, it's not necessarily about saving the sky. So where do you fall about, kind of your analysis about how those things are playing out?
On balance, this is obviously a very, ambiguous and Janus-faced thing. On balance, I would tend more towards the latter point. I think that competition with China can drive a good deal of positive stuff, particularly in the US, less so in Europe, of course. And since the Chinese have prioritized, really gaining a dominant place in global alternative energy markets, it's absolutely right and legitimate that we should compete with them. And once again, this threat of the idea of geopolitical competition in the economic sphere can actually mobilize politicians behind necessary action. The other thing is, in the wider question of the threat of climate change to our societies, I think it should have been evident for a long time, but has only really become accepted after COVID and latest developments, is the need to build resilience in our societies against global shocks, including climate change. And I think that the competition with China can also help drive that. We've become aware that this idea of a completely borderless, open world with completely interconnected supply chains and what's it called, last minute, up to the minute supplies.
Just in time.
Just in time. Sorry, yeah. Just in time. Yeah, that is profoundly dangerous. Yeah. So all this is good, but the problem is, I think that. Well, when it comes to public attention and political attention and will, people only have so much attention that they can give in their lives. I mean, I've managed to concentrate on climate change and the threat of war with Russia, basically by shutting down that part of my brain, where I remember where I left the house keys, or my scarf, or fortunately I have a family who remind me. That is reflected, of course, in priorities. It's reflected in spending.
Right.
And also, I mean, an example that I like to point to, because it is such an extreme one, is the Arctic. Because if you read, the security journals, the pages of the newspapers on the Arctic, it's now very largely about how the melting of the ice, that the real threat from the melting of the ice is that the Chinese and the Russians will sail some more ships through the Arctic. Well, I'm sorry. I mean, so what? Yeah. They're not going to invade northern Canada across the North Pole. That is truly, truly not the threat from the melting of the Arctic ice. The threat is, of course, that it will, to our societies, drown New York and London. But, of course, long, long before it's done that, it will have drowned Lagos and Karachi and Mumbai and the whole of Bangladesh. And, of course, long before the direct physical effects of that, become catastrophic for our societies, if you look at the state of Nigeria, for example, today, climate change has the capacity, feeding in, of course, as the Pentagon says, it's a threat multiplier, feeding into all these other things, ethnic conflict, water shortages, decaying states, to produce state collapse and huge movements of people in key parts of the world. Well, we know now the threat that this poses. I mean, as much, of course, the domestic reaction as the movement itself, but we know the threat this poses to the stability of our democracies.
We're going to take a quick ad break and come right back. So stay tuned.
Hey, here are some ads to help pay the bills. If you'd prefer a version without ads, subscribe to our member feed at wickedproblems.earth. A monthly subscription is cheaper than buying us a pint.
And I want to come back to the migration point, because I've raised it a couple times in a minute, but I think that just to stick with the Arctic and kind of nascent great power competition, I think was something interesting you wrote in that piece written the lead up to COP 28 in Dubai, which was, again, framing this ridiculous idea that, we're concerned about Russian and Chinese ships sailing in the Arctic, as opposed to, the long-term effects on the eastern seaboard of the U.S. But I suppose, kind of under the radar at the end of last year, the Biden administration quietly promulgated the extension of the continental shelf territorial claim in the Arctic out of the size of California, basically across, off the northern coast of Alaska. And I suppose that the suggestion has been that this is not so much a worry about ships as about great power competition about mineral rights, some other great game, some Daniel Jurgen The Prize, but Arctic version, critical minerals on the seabed type thing. And I think you pose an interesting question in that piece, if I'm not mistaken, which was that there is, amongst the elites in foreign policy on both sides of the Atlantic, where there is this kind of hangover of people who are essentially still fighting the last war. They're still thinking in those terms, as opposed to focusing, as you say, on the elephant in the room, which is that hundreds of millions of people in NATO countries are going to be affected by these effects. Never mind the second order effects from migration, etc. So, I mean, what's your take about whether or not people have learned anything over the last 4 years in terms of the security establishment on both sides of the Atlantic? Just to keep it there for the moment, on whether or not they've come to grips with this in a more mature way. Do you feel like it's going in the right direction, or do you feel like we're backsliding?
I think we're going backwards. As a result of the Russian invasion of Ukraine, which of course was a shocking event, and it's very natural that people should have reacted with alarm, and of course the growing competition with China. But I mean, also it's not just that our security elites are fighting the last war; they're fighting the last 1,000 wars. They are, after all, the security elites have been doing since security elites have existed, 6,000 years ago. They are, obsessed with the threat from rival states or rival kings. Although, perhaps I should have developed this more. I'm beginning to sort of write about this as well. From when states have first existed, they have had to worry about internal political disintegration, rebellion, ethnic strife, huge banditry. This, I think, by the way, is something that the Chinese, for example, given their history, actually understand much better than we do, the threat of internal disintegration and collapse. We have become very complacent about that, or at least it's a curious mixture, because on the one hand, people now talk continuously about the threat of fascism from Trump in America, from forces, like Alternative for Deutschland in Europe. But they don't really draw the conclusions from that, about the precedence of internal stability and consensus when it comes to, the defense of our societies. Because, the truth of the matter is, Russia and China are a certain threat to American global interests, but they're not going to invade the United States. Whereas, we could be heading for an internal political and constitutional battle in the United States, which really could cripple America as a state and a power.
And I suppose that, I want to come back to migration because it's more of an international issue. But here you are, back in the U.S. with a ringside seat for how this is going to play out in 2024. You've already mentioned the potential for it's kind of been an ongoing political crisis in the United States, really, since 2008 in some ways, in that the political system has never really quite absorbed the shocks in a way that it's now completely unrecognizable from what it was, certainly when I lived there, 25 years ago, and certainly even 20 years ago. It's just a very, very different place politically. So what do you feel that the stakes are in the outcome of political events in the U.S. in this calendar year? And I'm not just limiting it to the election, although that's going to be obviously one of the highlights. But, there are quite a few things that seem to be in the balance, which do play directly into both the state capacity of the United States to deal with not just climate, but other things. But obviously climate itself at a global level will be implicated by what happens as a result of some of the events of this year. So what's your take? How scared should I be?
Well, I think fairly scared. And one reason is that the US Constitution, which is, of course, a late 18th century constitution drawn up by white male patricians, who by the way, were actually anti-democrats. They were explicitly hostile to democracy. Quite frankly, it's not fit for purpose. It is set up for potential political, disaster, really. If you had a replay of what happened in 2000, when the election results were genuinely contested, not like 2020 when, whatever Trump said, it was actually clear who had won. Yeah. In 2020, it really wasn't clear who'd won because of the weird way the US Constitution works. And if that happens again, neither side will back down. In 2000, Al Gore backed down. Joe Biden will not back down to Trump, or if it's not Biden, somebody else. Trump most certainly will not back down.
Yeah.
And then what happens? Well, what happens is, at best, a major political crisis. At worst, something, well, much more violent than that.
I remember being on this side of the Atlantic for the 2000 election. I remember The Onion. I don't know if you're a fan of The Onion online magazine, but I remember seeing a headline in December of 2000 saying Serbian peacekeepers patrolling streets of Washington to help both sides de-escalate in the American conflict that's coming. And we all thought at the time, like, haha, that's so funny. And now it doesn't seem so funny.
Well, maybe not the Serbs, but no, it's true, and so there is that threat, and then of course there is, well, if Trump wins, it's clear that America will do nothing on climate change. In terms of industrial agendas, I think he will actually continue Biden's policies, because he of course, I mean, he said many of the same things actually on that, and of course especially the anti-China angle. Of course, he was much too dysfunctional and incompetent actually to do anything, right. But I don't think that he will reverse those. But certainly no further action on climate change.
I mean, yeah, it will be interesting to see whether or not there, the nods towards EVs and offshore wind, being demonized are ones that are just cosmetic and are simply there, or if in fact, they do get carried over into policy. I was listening to actually the same person who interviewed the review of your book that I just read out earlier, by Aris, in a thing called Unheard. I heard him on a panel discussion with Dr. Sumantra Maitra at where is he at? The American Institute. He's a senior editor of the American Conservative, and he's piece in the Federalist from 2019, headline, "Climate worship is nothing more than rebranded paganism." And essentially he seems to be lined up for, the old George Kennan job in state, or for some other role in the National Security Council, where, he will have some particular views about climate, and they're not great for listeners of this program. They're probably thinking that's probably not going to be super. So, I mean, do you think that, like, obviously the best we could hope for would be that being no further progress on climate policy in the United States, but do you feel worried that the Trump administration will just actively go out of its way, as per, Project 2025, to take a hatchet to wherever it's possible to existing, kind of not just Paris, but, other U.S. commitments, even at the state level, and trying to find ways to prevent things like California's moves to, both on, kind of automobile energy efficiency, or indeed SB 253 on climate, kind of risk disclosures. How bad could it get, I guess?
I think it could get pretty bad. I mean, and at the very least, even if they don't, deliberately take a wrecking ball to many of Biden's policies, they will certainly do their utmost to boost coal and fracking and drilling in the Arctic and so forth. So, yeah, I mean, I think it will take a major step backwards, unfortunately.
Right. And then finally, because I appreciate you've been very generous with your time, and I don't want to keep you beyond your point of patience. But I think one last thing on the state of American democracy, you wrote something in 2020, I think for National Interest, before the 2020 election, that if Tocqueville was alive, he'd say American democracy is doomed. Any reason to believe that's less true now than it was back then?
Well, I mean, my argument was, I'm not sure I quite, well, maybe I did say it was doomed. I mean, I said that, Tocqueville would have, Tocqueville said that there were two great pillars of American democracy. One was that this is basically a middle-class society with, compared to Europe, no great differences of status, and at least compared to Europe, not nearly such extremes of wealth and poverty. He was talking about the 1830s. Well, that has really ceased to be the case. And, there are so many statistics about how increasingly wealth is inherited, education is inherited, and a large mass of the population is largely shut out. Well, has certainly been shut out from the benefits of economic growth, but is also, excluded from the whole ladder of social and economic and political advancement. And the second thing he said was that amidst all these different American churches, there was a much deeper moral, cultural consensus in American society. And he was sometimes quite critical and satirical about this because of the conformism that it instilled. But he said that, basic agreement about essential moral issues is critical to the functioning of a successful democracy. Well, that's really gone out of the window. I mean, the Democrats under Biden have, at least the Democrat establishment, have tried to row back on some of the more extreme versions of that. The Republicans, for their part, have pushed ahead, even further. And having spent all those years in the Middle East and looking at the Middle East, it really does make you aware, looking at the example of Egypt, Iran, in the opposite direction, even Turkey, that it is very difficult to make democracy work if huge sections of the population have absolutely different ideas about the very identity of the country and the state. Democracy, as people have said, is very good at sorting out, second-order issues of policy. And that can change between elections, but you can't change, the whole cultural identity of the nation from one election to another. And, well, in the Middle East, that has ended up, of course, with a range of different dictatorships or semi-dictatorships.
Right. Do you think that migration has been something that has become more or less, as you expected, a salient issue that is going to affect the ability of Western democracies to be able to cope with some of, again, as a result of climate, but also as a result of their ability to be able to have a coherent response to some of these effects?
I think it's turning out pretty much as I expected. If you look at, what's happening in Europe now, if you look at the salience of this issue in the United States, and of course the fact that nobody really has any idea about what to do about it. I mean, in America there is they have more chances in this regard because, after all, this issue is overwhelmingly focused on Central America. And Central America, although it's in bad shape, is not in nearly as bad shape as Western Africa, for example. And that is what makes it so, I would say positively weird, that Ukraine has in 2 years had much more American aid than the whole of Mexico and Latin and Central America over the past 30 years. For years, Georgia, in the Caucasus, a country 6,000 miles from America, was getting more American aid than Mexico. Wow. America does actually look at what is now happening in Haiti, for example, but also, in Nicaragua, in Guatemala. America does have the capacity to give a lot of help to those societies and has every motive to do so. But once again, it is astonishing the degree to which domestic politics is obsessed with migration, but the security elites. You'd often think that the Donbass in eastern Ukraine is more important to America than what happens 100 yards across the Rio Grande. It's very strange.
Well, I hope we can come back and get your opinion about how strange it gets over the course of the rest of this year, Dr. Lieven. In the meantime, before I let you go, we ask people to come on the show. I don't know if you had a chance to see the notes, but to recommend 3 things that they've read, watched, listened to, etc., that have shaped their views on climate solutions, and in your case, how the intersection with policy. So anything you might be able to recommend for our audience?
On climate change, well, I think that Wallace Wells's book is excellent, and of course, sorry, my brain is going. The British peer Stern, Lord Stern, Nicholas Stern, he, from an economic point of view, and when it comes to the issues of state coherence and state collapse, Jared Diamond is of course excellent as well. So those have been three of my leading guides on this.
Right. Well, that's super helpful, Dr. Lieven. Thank you so much for coming on Wicked Problems. I hope we can get you again before the election to get your updates, maybe before November.
With great pleasure.
Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you.
Thanks for listening to Wicked Problems, made possible through the generosity of people like you. If you liked this conversation, please share it and leave us a rating and review on Apple Podcasts or Spotify. It really helps people find the show. If you'd like an ad-free version of this podcast, consider becoming a paid subscriber at wickedproblems.earth. You'll also get our newsletter, all our show notes, member-only goodies, and you'll be supporting media that wants to tell the stories at the frontier of climate tech, the place where people and politics, technology and capital meet and shape the future. And whether it's one you'd want to live in. Wicked Problems is written and edited by Richard Delavan. Production assistance was provided by me, Theodore Delavan. Wicked Problems, Climate Tech Conversations, is a production of Wicked Problems Limited. Thanks again for listening.